In the oldest stories, the world begins in chaos. But in Tijuana, chaos was a physical place, a sprawling shantytown made of cardboard, where light and life struggled to take form against the relentless wind. This was the city that would become the crucible of our subject's life, a place of two names and countless shadows, existing in the uneasy space between two nations. Good evening, and welcome back to the quiet of this narrative journey. Tonight, we begin not with the thunder of the gods, but with the low, steady rhythm of a city that has always defied easy definition. Tijuana, a name known across the globe, yet understood by few. It is a border town, rowdy and relentless, a nexus where the American dream and the Mexican reality meet in a bright, blinding friction. It is a place of perpetual movement, a city whose every story is tinged with the influence of the neighbor just across the line. The void of Cartonlandia, a border childhood. The man we follow, Ed Calderon, was born and raised within this magnetic pool. He grew up on that volatile border, a landscape that ensured a young mind would be shaped by a dual identity. His English, clear and unaccented, was not merely a convenience, but a necessity, an essential tool for navigation and survival in a city that constantly looked north. To secure a good job, to pursue a career path in many parts of Mexico, one must first pass the English exam, an invisible requirement etched into the very soil of the borderlands. Ed was raised in this Americanized current, practicing his language skills by translating for friends who had been deported south, those who grew up in the United States and suddenly found themselves adrift in the language of their ancestral home. To understand the core stability that anchored his early life, we must look to his parents, the foundation upon which his later choices would be judged. His father managed a family business specializing in electrical engineering, a world entirely unattached to the violence and the chaos that would later consume his son. This was a realm of practical application and ordered systems, a deep contrast to the disordered lives that surrounded them. The family was devoutly Catholic, and the presence of the Virgin of Guadalupe, a symbol of protection, motherhood, and faith, was a constant, silent fixture within the home. The household maintained a strict, traditional structure, offering a steady rhythm to the lives of the two older brothers and the youngest, Ed, who, as he puts it, was simply the accident. The maternal side of his history, however, offered a stark reminder of the depth of the city's struggle. His mother, a registered nurse, had ascended from the utter destitution that often characterized the border. She grew up in a place that older generations of Tijuana residents might remember as Cartonlandia. The name itself is a profound, sorrowful description. A shantytown built almost entirely of cardboard, a landscape of raw vulnerability. To rise from such a place, to become a nurse, a profession of healing and care, was not merely a career path. It was a testament to sheer willpower, a fierce rejection of the fate that the land itself had assigned. Collectively, this was a family of the lower middle class, a stratum that in Tijuana means continuous work, but also comparative privilege. They were not the elite, the oligarchic few who owned the land, but a working family who had achieved a measure of stability through diligence and shared effort. They all went to school, they all worked, and they were, by the city's standards, doing well. They stood upon a solid but not unshakable ground. Then, as in all the ancient myths, the stability was shattered by the intervention of tragedy, an act of fate that the family's faith could not absorb. When Ed was 13 years old, his middle brother, a young man of 19 who had been the promise, the golden child of the family, passed into finality. The funeral itself was an outpouring of communal grief, attracting thousands of people, a testament to the young man's light. But that sheer magnitude of sorrow became a destructive force within the private walls of the family home. The cessation of the existence of a child does terrible, silent things to those who remain. The mother, overwhelmed by the loss of her promise, descended into a psychiatric state, a collapse of the very foundation upon which the home was built. The father, unable to withstand the pressure of grief and responsibility, retreated into alcoholism. At 13, the younger brother found himself in a house where people were physically present, but spiritually and emotionally, there was nobody home. The sudden void of adult supervision and emotional presence forced a premature independence. Ed, now a grown-up in the shell of a child's body, began a long drift into the realm of petty crime. He engaged in fencing stolen goods, spent his time on the restless, rootless activities of skateboarding and graffiti, and immersed himself in the loud, consuming distraction of music. He became super independent, making money for himself, figuring things out on the street, and inevitably getting into trouble. He eventually attempted to find a purpose in the academic world, pursuing medical school for 2 years. But the focus required for such a disciplined path proved elusive. He was, by his own account, lost, directionless, and depressed, a common state for a young person on the border with limited options. In the early 2000s, following the seismic shift of the September 11th attacks, the border was a tense, volatile place, and the career paths were narrow. One could seek work in a call center, or one could look for a purpose that burned brighter. It was during this time that he saw a newspaper advertisement for an experimental police force. The concept itself was almost mythological, a unit to be developed from the ground up, to be involved in recruitment, training, and deployment by one man, Lieutenant Colonel Lirola. At the time, Lirola was an unknown entity, a former army officer who recognized that the existing structure of Mexican law enforcement was failing, if it existed at all. At this point, there was no true federal police, only army soldiers in gray uniforms riding in the back of trucks. The government, recognizing the need to establish a dedicated, trusted unit, decided to experiment at the state level. This was the force Ed joined, anticipating something clean and simple, perhaps a reflection of American police comedies he had seen. Instead, the fantasy dissolved on his first day in a refurbished prison, where he found himself being shaved bald by Mexican Special Forces soldiers, the very men who would later form the core of the brutal Zetas cartel. This was not a place for community policing or compassionate instruction. This was a process of calculated destruction, a dehumanizing rite of passage designed to strip away the softness of civilian life. It was a rigorous, brutal training that sought to break the recruits down to their core components. The training was a signal. The war that had not yet been formally declared was already here. A hidden conflict that demanded hard men, trained to do brutal work without giving any thought to the niceties of the law. The foundation of the next story would not be built on gold or glory, but on the pain and betrayal of the city itself. In the same space where the recruits were being broken, the army had recently carried out a mass arrest of state and local police on organized crime charges. A shadow had already fallen over the place of order, and the young men were about to be thrust into a war that had been raging in the darkness long before they arrived. The cartels were entrenched, the city was owned, and the fragile peace was about to shatter, leaving behind a landscape where every oath was subject to the blade of vengeance. Into this space of absolute disorder and fear, the young, directionless man had finally found a desperate purpose. The shattered vow, tragedy, and directionless youth. Every life has a turning point, a sudden, irreversible shift in the compass. For the young man, this moment arrived not in a flash of gunfire, but in the quiet, absolute finality of a cessation of existence that was too loud for the human spirit to bear. It was a tragedy that broke the strong, sturdy columns of a family home and scattered the pieces to the winds of sorrow. The family had been doing well, anchored by the devotion of the mother and the steady work of the father. Their stability was a rare, hard-won thing on the tumultuous border, providing a shelter of normalcy for the three sons. Ed, the youngest, had grown up within this protective shell, assured of a foundation that seemed as permanent as the Catholic faith they practiced. This foundation, however, proved to be built upon the fragile soil of mortality, which the ancient Greeks called fate. When Ed was 13 years old, his middle brother passed into finality. The brother was only 19, a young man who represented the family's promise, the hope they had invested in the future. He was, in the language of the family, the promised child. His funeral was not a small private affair, but a communal event of vast scale, almost a public spectacle of grief. Thousands of people arrived, drawn by the magnetism of the young man's life. This outpouring was a measure of the light he had carried, but the sheer size of the sorrow proved to be destructive when it returned to the intimacy of the family home. The unnatural cessation of the existence of a child does terrible, silent things to parents. It is a wound that never truly closes, a betrayal of the natural order. For the mother, the dedicated nurse who had fought her way out of the poverty of Cartonlandia, the grief was a force too overwhelming to contain. She suffered a complete psychological collapse, descending into a state that required continuous psychiatric care. Her spirit, once fiercely independent and resilient, was utterly broken. The pillar of the household, the figure who embodied healing and strength, was gone. The father, an engineer of steady, ordered systems, lacked the emotional tools to mend the profound rupture. He retreated into the oblivion of alcohol, becoming an alcoholic who was physically present but emotionally absent. The man who managed the electrical engineering business, the man of faith, could not manage the sudden, terrifying disorder of his own home. The Virgin of Guadalupe, the silent protector on their walls, could not avert this intimate ruin. At the tender age of 13, Ed Calderon found himself marooned in a house that was both full and empty. There were people there, his surviving family, but as he would recall, there was nobody home. The protective structure of his childhood had dissolved, and the compass of his life had spun violently, leaving him without guidance or direction. The sudden loss of that reliable, traditional framework forced a premature and dangerous self-reliance. He had to be a grown-up, but without the wisdom or resources of one. The path he chose was a common response to that kind of systemic void. He drifted into petty crime and the rough, anonymous freedom of the streets. He became adept at fencing stuff, selling stolen goods, a quick, dirty way to make money without the structure of a legitimate job. His days were filled with the kinetic energy of skateboarding, the defiant, territorial mark-making of graffiti, and the loud, consuming escape of music. These were the pursuits of a super-independent kid carving out a space for himself in the absence of a proper home. He started making his own money, learning to navigate trouble, and figuring things out on the streets of Tijuana, a city whose chaos was now reflected in his own soul. The yearning for a path, however, remained. Later attempted to find structure in the high demands of academia, trying his hand at medical school. He pursued this course for approximately 2 years, hoping that the rigor of science might impose an order on his life that his family could no longer provide. But the emotional void and the persistent lack of internal guidance were too strong. The effort did not work out for him. By the time he was in his late teens and early 20s, the world was shifting and his own life was in a state of suspended inertia. The geopolitical landscape of the early 2000s had changed dramatically after the attacks of September 11th. The border was under immense scrutiny, and the options for a young man with a tumultuous past and a lack of direction were few. He could attempt to work for a call center, a path that was not immediately open to him. Or he could find something that addressed his profound, restless need for purpose. It was into this atmosphere of personal and civic vacuum that the call for an experimental police force was issued. The advertisement, likely placed in a local newspaper, was a subtle invitation to the dispossessed, the ambitious, and the lost. The idea behind it was forged by a powerful necessity. The existing police structure in Baja was crippled by corruption and deeply compromised by the cartels. The federal presence was minimal, often limited to army soldiers moving without local intelligence or arresting powers. The man behind this audacious concept was Lieutenant Colonel Lirola. An army officer, then an unknown figure, he recognized that creating an effective police force required a radical intervention. He sought to develop a unit from the ground up, one that would be involved in everything from its own recruitment and training to its deployment in the streets. The core idea was to establish a pool of utterly trustworthy individuals, a new foundation untainted by the decades of graft and complicity. The political and economic pressure for this change was immense. Private money in Baja from the powerful, non-cartel-aligned business elite was fed up with the chaos. Political influence was aligned to a single party that had finally decided that the situation, characterized by abductions, protection schemes, and open violence in the streets, could no longer be tolerated. People who were in Tijuana at that time recall the brazen nature of the criminal organizations, rolling through downtown in convoys armed with AK-47s, openly defying the established order. These organizations were the remnants of the once dominant Arellano Félix Cartel, who were fighting to maintain control over their historic illicit product trafficking grounds. But they were being challenged by a pivotal betrayal. One of their own lieutenants, known as El Chato, had flipped, taking his people to join the nascent Sinaloa cartel. This act of treachery sparked a vicious war that raged so intensely it forced the authorities to seek radical, experimental solutions. The experimental police force, which Ed Calderon was about to join, was one such solution. This period, which was famously fictionalized in some television narratives, marked a crucial turning point in the history of organized crime in Tijuana. The Arellano Félix Cartel had been an entrenched oligarchic power for 20 years, a permanent fixture in the city's background. Everyone knew who they were. They were not subtle figures hiding in the shadows. They owned the city, controlling the police, high-level business, and local politics. Their wealth created the phenomenon of the Narco-Juniors, rich, upper-middle-class kids who joined the cartel out of proximity and opportunity, creating a perfect storm of social breakdown. The extent of their corruption was astonishing, even by the city's low standards. Members of the Arellano Félix organization had official identification from the state prosecutor's office and even the federal police. Photographs taken from official state prosecutor IDs, showing them in black blazers and white shirts, were later used on wanted posters at the border. The entire city was under the thumb of a dirty, co-opted system. In the 1990s, the city had been relatively calm, but the rift with the Sinaloa cartel forced the violence to the surface. Shootouts began to occur in broad daylight, sometimes involving the very police forces meant to contain them. A famous confrontation took place next to a large shopping center, a swap meet called El Soler, where federal police fought local police, both sides protecting their respective cartel interests. The city was bleeding, and the young man, having failed to find peace in medicine or stability in his shattered home, now found himself contemplating a career on the razor's edge of this very conflict. At the age of 20, Ed Calderon was working part-time for his father, selling videos at a rental store, lost and depressed. He had applied to call centers, but had been unsuccessful. The experimental police force, established with federal money under the intense pressure of the economic elite and the guiding vision of Lieutenant Colonel Lirola, offered him a purpose. Lirola's objective was twofold: to root out police corruption and to eliminate the cartels. He understood that a trustworthy group could not be pulled from the existing police ranks, as everyone was on the take. The idea was to build a brand new force, a clean slate that was not already compromised. The recruitment process was unlike anything seen before in Mexico. The candidates underwent a battery of confidence exams, modern psychological evaluations, rigorous physical tests, and extensive background checks, including home visits where neighbors were interviewed. The recruiters were looking for a specific profile, someone who was not connected to the cartels, whose family was clean, and who met the emotional requirements. Ed, lost and highly motivated, fit the profile of the perfect, directionless soldier. He needed a purpose, and they needed a clean slate they could shape. He had no children, no marriage, no ties, no vulnerabilities that could be easily exploited. He was, therefore, the ideal raw material for the specialized, brutal work that lay ahead. With acceptance into this force, the young man had finally found a direction. He had traded a chaotic childhood for a structured, albeit brutal, military existence. Yet the price of purpose would be a complete and irreversible immersion into a world where cessation of existence was measured not in sorrow, but in its potential for political vengeance. The recruitment process was merely the beginning. What followed was a deliberate, agonizing descent into the crucible, a trial by fire designed not merely to train, but to destroy and then rebuild men who could withstand the unimaginable. The path to the truth lay through the loss of self, a journey that began with the sudden, shocking removal of all that was familiar. The crucible of Lirola, birth of the experimental police. The city groaned under a hidden violence, not yet a declared war, but a slow, continuous poisoning of the public system. Into this darkness, where the local law enforcement had become the cartel's most reliable ally, a vision was cast by one man, a single, determined lieutenant colonel who saw not police, but a tool of surgical, untainted force. The authority, recognizing this profound vacuum, decided to initiate a bold experiment at the state level in Baja California. This was before the national conflict known as the Illicit Commerce War, before the year 2006, but the violence was already an endemic, crippling feature of life. As one generation of recruits was being trained, an event occurred in the same facility that served as a chilling omen. The army conducted a mass arrest of state and local police officers, sweeping them up on organized crime charges and dispatching them to Mexico City. The rot was known, acknowledged, and finally being acted upon. The true impetus for this new force came from the collision of political will and private, exhausted money. The wealthy and politically influential private sector in Baja California had reached a breaking point. They were no longer willing to tolerate the daily reality of kidnappings for ransom, the insidious spread of protection schemes, and the brazen, open convoys of heavily armed criminals on the streets of downtown Tijuana. This was the era where two major criminal organizations were fighting openly for control. This was the war sparked by the crumbling of the Arellano Félix Cartel's long-standing dominion. They had been a background presence for 2 decades, an oligarchic force that felt as permanent as the mountains. But they had suffered a fracture, a betrayal by one of their key enforcers, a man known to them as El Chato. He defected, taking his specialized knowledge and his men to the rival Sinaloa cartel, initiating a vicious, high-profile war that raged across the borderlands. The level of international attention this violence attracted demanded that the authorities respond with something new, something that would appear untainted. The architect of this response was a man named Lieutenant Colonel Lirola. An unknown figure at the time, he was a former army officer who had a clear, uncompromising vision. His central objective was twofold and unyielding: to root out police corruption and to terminate the cartels. Lirola understood with cold clarity that the existing police force was structurally incapable of doing either. Because almost everyone in the established ranks was on the take, a new organization had to be conceived that was entirely outside the system's gravitational pull. The idea was to build a brand new force, a clean slate of young recruits who had not been corrupted by the old, compromised structures. Lirola planned to control every step of this process. The rigorous recruitment, the brutal training, and the final strategic deployment into the war-torn city. This ambitious goal required an unprecedented level of professionalism and scrutiny, a stark contrast to the existing, compromised methods. The recruitment process was a deliberate, almost surgical attempt to import the discipline of Americanized policing into the Mexican state system. They began with a series of confidence exams that were unheard of in traditional Mexican law enforcement. Candidates, including Ed Calderon, underwent modern psychological evaluations designed to probe their mental fortitude and stability. They faced polygraph examinations, tests of truth that were meant to serve as unblinking, mechanical judges of character. Beyond these tests, the scrutiny extended to the very fabric of the recruit's life. Recruiters conducted extensive, thorough home visits where they would speak directly to neighbors. The goal was to ensure that neither the recruit nor his family had any existing connections to organized crime. They were looking for a very specific profile, a particular kind of human vulnerability that could be channeled into strength. Young people who were highly motivated, energetic, and directionless. They needed a purpose, and the force offered them an immediate, all-consuming one. The ideal recruit was a clean slate, someone who could be molded into whatever shape the mission demanded. Crucially, the force actively discouraged applicants who were married or had children, eliminating the primary lines of financial or emotional compromise that cartels often exploited. Ed Calderon, young, lost, energetic, and lacking the stabilizing force of family ties, was a perfect match for the required profile. He had raw potential waiting for a direction. The training that followed was a radical departure from traditional policing, moving closer to military-style brutalization. On the very first day, the recruits found themselves in a refurbished prison, stripped down and shaven bald. The instructors were former special forces, hard men trained for brutal work, who made it immediately clear that community policing was not the agenda. The process was designed to be dehumanizing, stripping away the recruit's identity and individuality. The psychological warfare was subtle but constant. Recruits were repeatedly told that the facility's gates were always open, that they were not held against their will and could leave whenever they wished. This constant verbal emphasis on freedom served only to deepen the psychological pressure, ironically making them more determined to stay and prove their worth. During the first night, a meticulous process of scrutiny began. All recruits were stripped naked in a dormitory, and Army personnel inspected every crevice of their bodies, looking for any evidence of gang tattoos or signs of past affiliations. This scrutiny continued throughout the entire training period, operating like a constant, unseen big brother. Every conversation was listened to, every reaction recorded, every phone call monitored. The intensity was designed to be a continuous test of resolve. The physical demands were immense, rising at 4 a.m. for 90 minutes of running, followed by rapid-fire meals and mandatory marches. The food was intentionally meager and horrible, a deliberate method of testing the men's resolve and making them quit. A significant academic component was also integrated into the training, with mandatory exams and strict passing requirements. The dual approach, physical brutality and academic rigor, was designed to weed out the weak-minded. They were looking for individuals who would not break under pressure, and therefore would not be susceptible to the cartel's immense financial pressure later on. Of the initial 50 recruits, only 20 remained at the conclusion of the process. This period was not without its shadows and failures. The script notes that sexual assaults occurred during training, perpetrated by the staff against some of the female candidates, forcing some to leave. The level of brutality employed by the instructors would be unthinkable in the modern era, or even in the training camps of their northern neighbor. One instance involved an AK-47 being fired near a recruit's face to simulate reality, an act of violence that led to permanent hearing loss for the narrator. This was a time before widespread cell phone cameras, a period where such clandestine training could be executed in a free-for-all environment, with instructors often disappearing without explanation. The successful 20 graduates were given their basic equipment, a radio and a gun. They were trained on the Beretta 92FS, a 9mm pistol, but upon graduation were unexpectedly handed a Glock, a weapon many had never seen and did not know how to operate, requiring a hurried, improvised education. The training was over, but the reality was only just beginning. On graduation day, the solemn weight of their new reality settled upon them. They were issued life insurance policies from a large, reputable firm, MetLife, and were explicitly told that they were about to assume the most dangerous job on the planet, in the most dangerous city on the planet, by the official numbers. The simple act of signing those life insurance policies, documents that today are no longer available to their successors, was a stark, chilling measure of the life expectancy they were choosing. They were then given a sobering reality check by the older guys who returned to the academy. The unit was underfunded and under-equipped. They lacked enough guns for every man, and support response times were terrifyingly slow, sometimes 20 minutes to arrive at a crime scene. The men realized they were not entering a system of law, but a brutal, desperate experiment. Their initial operational structure was chaotic, a product of necessity rather than design. The 20 operatives or operativos, in Tijuana were spread across the city, working in mixed groups, or grupos mixtos, in coordination with the army. The army, however, was in the dark, unfamiliar with the nuances of the illicit commerce conflict, and desperately needed operatives who possessed both arresting powers and local knowledge. Ed Calderon's first mission, however, would be neither tactical nor complex. It would be a simple, devastating lesson in the raw horror that now governed his life. He had volunteered for a raid, anticipating the use of a battering ram and chains. Instead, he was told to retrieve the bolt cutters. His very first task as a new law enforcement officer was to climb a pedestrian bridge to cut down a silent body. A young man who had been hanged by a single leg, his face covered in plastic and duct tape. The body was a message, and the messenger was his new life. The crucible of Lirola, built on hope and desperation, had manufactured a small group of competent, hardened men. But it had also stripped them of their innocence and armed them with a profound personal knowledge of their own mortality. They were the tip of a spear forged in the fire of public fear, and they were about to be thrust into a conflict that was far older and more complex than any of them could imagine. The rules were gone, the enemy was unseen, and the only certainty was the violence that awaited them on the streets below. Shaved bald, the dehumanizing of the recruit. The promise of police academy quickly dissolved into a single, brutal certainty. A refurbished prison served as the training grounds, the glint of razor blades reflecting the harsh light, and the silent presence of men who would one day become known as the Zetas stood as the unblinking, terrifying instructors. This was a rite of passage designed not merely to train, but to fundamentally alter the soul. The recruits found themselves inside a facility that was, in truth, an old, refurbished prison. The air was thick with the history of incarceration, but their immediate concern was the men in charge. Their instructors were not traditional police officers, but hardened former Mexican Special Forces soldiers, men trained to do exactly the brutal work the state now required. These were the very individuals who would later break off to form the core of the infamous Zetas cartel, a fact that in retrospect cast a profound, cold shadow over the legitimacy of the training itself. The methods employed were entirely antithetical to the principles of community policing. They were designed for dehumanization. The process began with the symbolic removal of identity. On the very first day, the recruits were all shaved bald. This was not merely a matter of hygiene, but an act of stripping away individuality, ensuring that every man looked uniform, disposable, and ready to be rebuilt. The instructors had no interest in molding compassionate cops. They were interested only in breaking the men down to their core components. The psychological warfare was immediate and constant. The instructors made it a point to show the recruits the main gate to the facility, emphasizing that it remained open at all times. The message, delivered with chilling frequency, was that they were not here by force and could leave whenever they wished. This statement, repeated over and over, was a brilliant and brutal piece of manipulation. By explicitly offering freedom, the instructors played directly on the recruits' desire to prove their worth, their need for belonging, and their pride. It was a psychological torment that ultimately made them more determined to stay and endure. The first night provided a further descent into the dehumanizing ritual. The entire group was gathered, ordered to strip down completely, and forced to stand naked in the dormitory. Army personnel, acting as observers and guards, conducted forensic-level inspection of their bodies.
They checked every crevice, between fingers, behind ears, under lips, searching meticulously for any sign of tattoos, particularly those that could be associated with gangs or criminal affiliations. While this invasive physical inspection was underway, other personnel were watching, recording, and listening. They monitored reactions and conversations, listening for any sign of dissent, fear, or a hidden past. This surveillance was constant, a pervasive Big Brother atmosphere that permeated the entire training. Recruits realized that their interactions, their whispers, even their unspoken fears were being logged. The goal was simple: ensure the recruits were clean, identify psychological weaknesses, and measure their reaction to absolute loss of privacy and dignity. The attrition rate was a testament to the brutality of the selection process. Of the original cohort of approximately 50 recruits, only 20 survived to graduate. This weeding out process was deliberate, focused on pushing the man to their physical and mental breaking points. The authorities understood that the individuals who chose to quit were often the ones who would later break under cartel pressure. They sought to eliminate weak-minded people who might flip or compromise the entire unit. The daily routine was an unending cycle of exhaustion and deprivation. Recruits were awakened at 4 o'clock in the morning to begin an hour and a half of running, a grueling cardio session that demanded absolute physical commitment. This was followed by a hurried shower and a rapid meal. The food itself was part of the punishment. Instructors would mockingly refer to the promised bread, a symbol of sustenance, only to reveal that it had run out weeks ago. The recruits were, by their own account, treated like human garbage for the first few months, a calculated process designed to make them quit. The physical demands were matched by an equally rigorous academic component. The recruits were required to attend classes, learn technical material, and pass demanding exams. Failure in the classroom was as decisive as failure on the running track. If a recruit could not pass the academic assessments, he was immediately kicked out. The force required men who were not merely physically tough, but who possessed the mental discipline to absorb and apply complex information. The training drew men from diverse and surprising backgrounds. There were former members of the Mexican Army's Special Forces, including one soldier who had fought in the conflict in Chiapas against the Zapatista National Liberation Army. There were also recruits from humble, remote backgrounds, such as a young man from Michoacán who had worked on a farm his entire life and struggled with basic literacy, requiring the help of his peers to pass the exams. For all of them, the force offered the same rare commodity: a well-paying job and a career path in a country that offered few legitimate opportunities for young men. They were literally surrendering to exhaustion in training to secure this position. The brutality was raw, unfiltered, and deeply rooted in a cultural acceptance of pain. The physical beatings were not uncommon. The simulation of a firefight involved instructors firing an AK-47 mere feet from the recruits' faces to achieve reality, an act of violence that led to permanent hearing loss for the narrator. The sound was so loud that the first shot deafened the man, and the subsequent rounds were experienced only as a muffled sensation, as if he were underwater. This type of training, occurring before the era of instant communication and cell phone cameras, was conducted with little oversight, often improvised, with a singular focus on achieving a cold, functional resilience. The force attempted to draw on American best practices, seeking a measure of professionalism that the Mexican police force had long abandoned. They were certified by the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies, CALIA,
an American certification program. This was an astonishing level of oversight for a Mexican police unit, demonstrating the seriousness of the effort to build an incorruptible force. Upon graduation, the 20 surviving operativos were sworn in. They received a radio and a weapon. Though they had trained extensively with the Beretta 92FS, a 9mm pistol, they were instead handed a Glock, a weapon many had never seen before and did not know how to operate, requiring a hurried, improvised education. This small but critical detail highlighted the logistical chaos and underfunding that plagued the organization. The recruits were forced to seek out information on the internet to learn how to operate their primary sidearm. The new reality was sealed with a piece of paper. The graduates were required to sign their life insurance policies from the reputable American firm MetLife, and were explicitly told that they were about to assume the most dangerous job on the planet, in the most dangerous city on the planet by the official numbers. The simple act of signing those life insurance policies, documents that today are no longer available to their successors, was a stark, chilling measure of the life expectancy they were choosing. They were then given a sobering reality check by the older guys who returned to the academy. The unit was underfunded and under-equipped. They lacked enough guns for every man, and support response times were terrifyingly slow, sometimes 20 minutes to arrive at a crime scene. The men realized they were not entering a system of law, but a brutal, desperate experiment. Their initial operational structure was chaotic, a product of necessity rather than design. The 20 operatives, or operativos, in Tijuana were spread across the city, working in mixed groups, or grupos mixtos, in coordination with the army. The army, however, was in the dark, unfamiliar with the nuances of the illicit commerce conflict, and desperately needed operatives who possessed both arresting powers and local knowledge. Ed Calderon's first mission, however, would be neither tactical nor complex. It would be a simple, devastating lesson in the raw horror that now governed his life. He had volunteered for a raid, anticipating the use of a battering ram and chains. Instead, he was told to retrieve the bolt cutters. His very first task as a new law enforcement officer was to climb a pedestrian bridge to cut down a silent body, a young man who had been hanged by a single leg, his face covered in plastic and duct tape. The body was a message, and the messenger was his new life. The crucible of Larola, built on hope and desperation, had manufactured a small group of competent, hardened men, but it had also stripped them of their innocence and armed them with a profound, personal knowledge of their own mortality. They were the tip of a spear forged in the fire of public fear, and they were about to be thrust into a conflict that was far older and more complex than any of them could imagine. The rules were gone, the enemy was unseen, and the only certainty was the violence that awaited them on the streets below. The filter of trust, selection, and the clean slate. To fight the hidden enemy, the architects of this new force had to first ensure the purity of their own hands. A selection process was initiated as rigorous as it was invasive, seeking the lost and the unattached, the perfect, malleable components for a war of surgical clarity. Lieutenant Colonel Larola, the force's architect, understood that the new unit's success would not be determined by their weapons, but by their unwavering loyalty. The existing police forces were compromised, their loyalty purchased by the criminal organizations. The only path to trust was to build a force that was, from its very beginning, incorruptible. This requirement led to the creation of a vetting system that was both modern and profoundly intrusive.
It represented a desperate, Americanized approach to law enforcement, contrasting sharply with the customary Mexican police recruitment, which often relied on familial connections. This new generation of recruits, however, had to pass a gauntlet of tests designed to strip away all pretense and expose the raw, unvarnished nature of the man beneath the uniform. The core of the selection process revolved around confidence exams. These were not simple paper tests, but a series of psychological and physical evaluations that would be considered highly aggressive even by elite international standards. The candidates underwent comprehensive psychological evaluations, modern assessments aimed at probing their mental fortitude, stability under duress, and potential vulnerabilities. The goal was to identify and eliminate anyone exhibiting signs of weakness, as the enemy, once encountered, would exploit any fissure in the recruits' armor. Following the psychological testing, the candidates faced the polygraph examination, often referred to as a lie detector test. This mechanical scrutiny served as an objective, unblinking judge of their past actions and potential future loyalties. The polygraph was a tool of absolute division, separating the clean slates from those whose histories might hold hidden dangers. This technology, then a rarity in Mexican law enforcement, symbolized the force's commitment to an imported, uncompromising idea of honesty. The scrutiny extended aggressively beyond the individual to the entire social fabric of his life. Recruiters conducted extensive and unexpected home visits, arriving at the family residence to interview neighbors and acquaintances. These interviews were meticulous, designed to verify that the recruit and his family had no prior or current connections to organized crime. The entire network of the individual was mapped and judged, ensuring that no immediate, exploitable loyalty to a cartel existed in their social orbit. What emerged from this rigorous filtering process was a highly specific profile, a demographic that proved to be ideal raw material for the kind of war that lay ahead. The force was specifically seeking young people who were highly motivated, energetic, and directionless. These were the individuals who needed a purpose, who were searching for an external structure to give meaning to their shattered or uncertain lives. The recruiters correctly assessed that a young man who felt kind of lost was the perfect soldier, someone who would cling fiercely to the mission and the structure it provided, eager to prove his worth. Crucially, the force implemented a policy of discouraging or disallowing candidates who were married or had children. This requirement was a clear-eyed recognition of vulnerability. A man with a family to support has financial needs that can be immediately exploited by a cartel's immense purchasing power. By recruiting the unattached, the force eliminated the primary point of financial and emotional leverage the cartels traditionally used to compromise police loyalty. The perfect recruit was, therefore, a clean slate, free from the burdens that could be easily twisted into a tool of betrayal. Ed Calderon, with his shattered family foundation, his sense of being lost, and his lack of external ties, was an ideal candidate. He possessed the raw energy and motivation they sought, and his history, though tumultuous, was free of direct cartel links. He was raw clay, ready to be molded into the uncompromising shape of a counterinsurgent. He had a profound personal need, and the force offered him a singular, all-consuming direction. The commitment to this rigorous, Americanized approach was codified through a rare official endorsement. The experimental police unit was certified by the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies, CALEA, an American certification program. This was a mark of international professional standardization, a rare achievement for any Mexican police organization.
The certification was meant to signal that this unit operated according to a gold standard, setting it apart from the compromised forces that surrounded them. However, the high standard of selection did not mitigate the brutality of the training itself. The physical regime was designed to be deliberately grueling, pushing the recruits beyond the point of normal endurance. The physical examination itself was merely the prerequisite for the long, agonizing test of resolve that followed. The day began relentlessly at 4 o'clock in the morning. The first required activity was a continuous session of running that often lasted for 90 minutes. This intense early morning cardio was essential, and the narrator credits his past as a skateboarder for giving him the stamina to pass these initial cardio evaluations. He humorously recalls doing his run in a famous brand of sturdy canvas shoe, a detail that underscores the improvised reality of the training setup. This physical demand was continuous. The recruits were subjected to endless cycles of marching and standing in order under the brutal sun. The food provided was intentionally scarce and repulsive, designed to challenge their will to continue. The psychological intent was clear: to make people quit. Those who broke were deemed weak-minded, unfit for the task of resisting the massive financial and lethal pressures that awaited them in the field. The intensity of the training also brought together men from starkly contrasting backgrounds, united only by their desperation for a stable, legitimate future. Among the recruits was a white Mexican man whose lack of natural pigment led to a severe, giant blister materializing on his bald head due to the relentless sun. There was also a former Army Special Forces man who had served in the Chiapas conflict, bringing with him a seasoned, hardened perspective. And there were men from rural areas like Michoacán who possessed strong physical frames from a lifetime of farm work, but struggled intensely with the academic components, requiring their comrades to assist them with writing and passing the exams. For all of them, the driving force was clear. The job offered a well-paying salary, a rare opportunity for young men in their age bracket and social class. They were, in the narrator's terms, committing fully to secure a position that promised stability and purpose. The details of the job, however, remained vague, nebulous, and terrifyingly uncertain. They asked the obvious question: how could a small group of 20 men possibly go out and conduct effective operations against the entrenched, overwhelming forces that controlled the city? The answer would be found not in the numbers, but in the ruthlessness of their specialized mission. As the training progressed, the recruits began to receive visits from the older guys, the first generation of operativos who were already in the field. These visits served as a grim reality check, contrasting sharply with the idealism of the academy. It was during these briefings that the true gravity of their situation settled in their stomachs. They learned they did not have enough rifles for every person, that support took too long to arrive, and that comrades had already suffered fatal outcomes on the roadside. The final act of their enrollment, signing their life insurance policies from the reputable American firm MetLife, was performed alongside the crushing knowledge that they were about to enter the most dangerous job on the planet, in the world's most dangerous city. The policies were a transactional measure of their risk, a dark contract with fate that acknowledged their likely mortality. The training culminated with the graduates being issued their initial gear. Though they had been trained in the Beretta 92 FS, the supply chain delivered a Glock, a more modern but unfamiliar pistol. This small, crucial detail underscored the chaos and lack of coordination within the very authority that had commissioned them. They were armed, trained, and certified, yet forced to improvise their knowledge of their primary weapon. The unit they became the operativos, was a concentrated force of 20 elite men in Tijuana, spread across the city in small teams. Their first missions were to work alongside the army, bridging the gap between military force and legal arresting power. The army, lacking local intelligence and legal authority, relied entirely on these new, clean-slate operatives to navigate the city's complex criminal and political terrain. The young man, driven by a deep, new purpose, was about to step onto the stage of a war that had been raging in the shadows for 2 decades. The selection process was over, and the truth of his new life had been sealed by an open grave and a signed policy. The only thing that remained was the final, devastating initiation. The first descent into the city's dark, beating heart. The Narco-Junior oligarchy and the Serpent's War. The violence that birthed the force was rooted in an old empire crumbling. The Arellano Félix Cartel, deeply entrenched in the city's very bones, was suddenly challenged by a single, seismic act of betrayal, a fracturing that forced the hidden war into the unforgiving light of day. The systemic corruption that defined Tijuana's past set the stage for the chaotic violence that greeted the new police recruits. For 2 decades, the city had been governed not by its elected officials, but by an entrenched oligarchy, the Arellano Félix Cartel, or AFO. This organization was more than a criminal group. It was a permanent, powerful feature of the landscape, a force that had absorbed and controlled the very infrastructure of the state. To live in Tijuana during this period was to live under a silent yet absolute dominion. The AFO was not a hidden entity. They were an open, arrogant power. As our subject notes, everybody knew who they were. This was not because they were hiding, but because they had achieved a terrifying level of systemic control. They owned everybody. They controlled the chief of police. They had agents deeply embedded in politics, and they held sway over high-level business throughout the region. This proximity to power and wealth gave rise to a chilling phenomenon unique to the border elite: the Narco-Juniors. These were the children of the rich, upper-middle-class families who, through a perfect storm of opportunity and social acceptance, found themselves joining the cartel. These young people attended the high society schools alongside the children of legitimate business owners. For them, the cartel was not a distant, shadowy organization, but a part of their social inheritance, a chance to access immense, illicit power and wealth. The extent of the AFO's infiltration into the legitimate state was astonishing. Members of the Arellano Félix organization had secured official state prosecutor identification cards and federal police ID cards, documents that afforded them the authority to move and operate with impunity. They were, in effect, deputized criminals. The U.S. government later discovered these official photographs, which showed high-level AFO members like Ramon and Benjamin Arellano Félix dressed in black blazers, white shirts, and black ties, and used them on wanted posters along the border. The shock was twofold. The whole city was under the thumb of a dirty system, and the criminals were wearing the uniforms of the state. For years, throughout the 1990s, the city had enjoyed a period of relative calm. This was not the peace of justice, but the quiet of absolute control. The AFO had achieved total command of the territory, and there was little need for internal violence. But this artificial quiet was shattered when a deep, fundamental rift occurred within the criminal structure, forcing the war to the surface. The catalyst was an act of profound, high-stakes treachery. The challenge to the AFO's throne did not come from a rival king, but from within their own ranks. A key lieutenant and enforcer known as El Chato, whose name roughly translates to the flat-nosed one, betrayed the Arellano Félix family.
he defected, taking his specialized knowledge and his fighting personnel to join the rising power of the Sinaloa cartel. This betrayal was a declaration of war. It immediately dissolved the territorial peace and initiated a conflict that raged with such intensity it brought international attention to Tijuana. The fight was over the control of historic illicit commerce grounds, and it forced the authorities, including Lieutenant Colonel Lirola, to scramble for solutions like the one that produced our subject's experimental police force. The city's decay became visible. The public saw the direct, violent results of this territorial dispute.
First major shootout that signaled the end of the 1990s peace took place next to a public swap meet called El Soler. The confrontation was not a clash between police and criminals, but a brutal gun battle between the federal police and the local police. Both forces were, in reality, serving as private armies, protecting their respective cartel patrons. The veil of legitimate authority had completely dropped, revealing the ugly truth of the city's ownership. As the violence escalated, the young man, now a new recruit, found himself forced to reckon with the moral cost of the conflict. A cost that was sometimes intensely personal. He recalls a friend from his youth, a red-headed boy he knew as Rojo, who came from a respectable, tragedy-free family, far more stable than his own. Years later, while Ed was working in a mixed operations group, a Grupo Mixto, doing surveillance in civilian attire, he witnessed a large convoy of vehicles at a gas station. He volunteered to do a walk-by, a simple surveillance measure. As he passed, he heard his name called and a distinct whistle, a local signal he immediately recognized. He turned to find Rojo. His former friend stood there, a grim specter of what Ed might have become. Rojo was wearing a tactical chest rig loaded with AK-47 magazines, holding a compact Draco AK pistol without a stock. The men surrounding him were in a mix of clothing, some wearing police uniforms that Ed immediately recognized as fake because the boots and gear did not match official issues. Rojo called him over, genuinely friendly, and engaged in small talk, inquiring about family and life. The young officer, with a gun and a phone secreted on his person, could barely speak. His tongue was dry in his throat. He claimed to be looking for a job, deliberately referencing his last known position at the video store. Rojo, now making boasts about the money he was earning, received a call and had to depart. In their final brief exchange, the old friend gave a profound and chilling warning. As they shared a quick, private side hug, Rojo spoke directly into Ed's ear. "I think I know what you do. You should be careful. You should get out." The message was clear. Your secret is visible. Your choice is dangerous. And your fate is already decided. This was not a threat, but an oracle of doom, a final act of friendship before the two paths diverged irrevocably. The young officer left, shaken by the reality that his purpose had already been compromised by the proximity of his past. This brief encounter illustrated the fundamental structural weakness of the entire law enforcement system. The corruption was a layered matrix operating across multiple tiers. The municipal and local police were the primary intelligence. State and federal officials provided the protection, and the Narco-Juniors blurred the line entirely. In this environment, Lieutenant Colonel Lirola's strategy of creating a clean slate force was the only logical choice. He was trying to bypass a system that was structurally designed to fail. The experimental police force comprised only 20 operativos in Tijuana, compared to the thousands of municipal police and an unknown number of cartel soldiers who roamed the city.
The war that erupted had a specific economic engine. The violence was not random, it was highly targeted. The incoming Sinaloa cartel sought to diminish the AFO's influence by targeting the most exposed elements of their operation, the sales points. These were the local illicit product markets, the retail end of the operation, that were easily identifiable and required constant, localized protection. This focus on the domestic illicit commerce demand within Mexico itself accounted for a massive portion of the daily acts of finality and shootouts. The violence was thus a constant, high-pressure fight for territory. To affect the rivals' business, the cartels would target the sales points, terminate the police officers who were on the take and working for the other side, and burn businesses that were under the rivals' protection rackets. This is how the city was driven into a state of continuous, visible chaos, a chaos that was now the daily reality for Ed Calderon. He joined the service at the age of 20, driven by a desperate need for structure. The shadow of his past had served as a grim oracle, confirming the existential peril of his new path. The young operative had been warned, and now he was about to face the ultimate reality of a war where the enemy was often indistinguishable from the supposed law. The gas station oracle, vengeance foretold. In the earliest days of surveillance, the worlds of the past and the present collided, offering a final, silent warning. A chance meeting at a gas station, a whispered truth, and a life spared by the bond of childhood became a profound oracle of vengeance foretold. The young operative, Ed Calderon, had been forged in the crucible of training and was now thrust into the chaotic streets as part of a mixed operations group, a Grupo Mixto, composed of the army and the new experimental police. His work was surveillance, frequently dressed in civilian attire, his only markers of authority, a concealed weapon, and a sense of absolute purpose. This anonymity was a necessity. It was during one of these routine assignments, a quiet act of reconnaissance, that the past suddenly lunged forward to seize the present. The mission required him to volunteer for a walk-by of a gas station, an area where a massive amount of vehicles had gathered, suggesting a high-level presence of organized crime. As he approached, performing the slow, measured walk of a civilian with a hidden agenda, he found himself scrutinizing the group of men. They were gathered around large, expensive sport utility vehicles, including Suburbans and Tahoes. Some men were wearing what appeared to be police uniforms, a visual contradiction that instantly marked them. Entire scene is compromised. Then, from among the crowd, he heard his name called. It was followed by a distinct whistle, a high-pitched, local signal he instantly recognized from his childhood on the streets of Tijuana. His heart seized, his mind recognizing the sound before his eyes confirmed the identity of the person who had summoned him. Rojo. The figure who stood before him was no longer the boy from his childhood. Rojo was now a soldier in the Serpent's War, a fully integrated member of a criminal organization. The contrast was stunning. Rojo was armed for conflict, wearing a heavy tactical chest rig filled with AK-47 magazines. In his hand, he carried a short, compact Draco AK pistol. The young operative, armed only with a concealed pistol and a desperate composure, found his tongue dry in his throat. He was caught, exposed, and entirely vulnerable. Rojo, completely unaware of his friend's true purpose, was genuinely friendly. He engaged in small talk, the mundane, inquiries of two people who had not seen each other in years. Ed Calderon improvised, claiming to be looking for a job, referencing his last known position at the video store, effectively selling a lie that masked his true lethal intent. Rojo, in turn, began to brag about the money he was making. The conversation was mercifully short, Rojo received a call and was required to return to his group. It was in the finer, fleeting moments of their farewell that the old loyalty intervened. As they shared a quick, customary side hug, Rojo leaned in and whispered directly into the operative's ear. The warning was clear and absolute. "I think I know what you do. You should be careful. You should get out." This was not a threat. It was an oracle. Rojo, the friend, had seen through the thin disguise of the clean-cut civilian. This whisper was a finer, desperate act of warning, confirming the existential peril of Ed Calderon's new path. His secret was known, his danger was absolute, and he had been granted a brief, temporary reprieve from a life his friend had chosen. The young operative immediately understood the gravity of the message and left the scene really quickly. The encounter served as a devastating, intimate lesson in the structural integrity of corruption in Tijuana. It showed that the contamination was not merely institutional, it was relational, existing between families and childhood friends. The young operative, at the age of 20, was now forced to confront the reality that his purpose was compromised by the very people he had grown up with. He was now operating in a world where the enemy was fluid, intelligent, and often wearing the remnants of a police uniform. The whisper from Rojo was more than a warning. It was a psychological marker. It signified that the stakes were no longer abstract or political. They were intensely personal. He could be terminated not by a stranger, but by a childhood friend. A chilling fate that underscored the brutal intimacy of the Tijuana conflict. He had escaped the void of his broken home, only to walk directly into the open jaws of a systemic violence that had already devoured his friend. The only certainty was the violence that lay ahead, a violence that demanded a physical response untainted by hesitation or moral ambiguity. The hangman's sign, first day in the field. The first assignment came not as a raid, but as a gruesome, solitary favor. A command to retrieve a silent body left dangling from a pedestrian bridge. It was the young operative's immediate and devastating lesson in the new calculus of cruelty, where a swift cessation of existence was considered an act of profound mercy. The young operative, fresh out of the crucible, was assigned his first job on his very first day in the field. He was eager, still viewing his role through a lens of cinematic action. Instead, an older operative, a veteran of the chaos, called out to him with a simple command: "Go get the bolt cutters." Mission was a payment for a social debt involving a forensic specialist. The young operative rushed to retrieve the required tool, along with a battering ram and his other gear, only to be met with a skeptical look. The battering ram was unnecessary. They were not going on a raid. They were going to go cut somebody off a bridge. The car ride to the scene was a journey into the heart of the macabre. They arrived at a pedestrian bridge, a public, high-traffic structure now repurposed as a stage for terror. What the operative saw defied his training. Hanging from an electrical wire, secured by a single knot tied around one leg, was the silent body of a young man. The way the body was displayed was deliberate, a grotesque mirror of an ancient symbol. The victim's other leg was crossed over the secured one, almost mimicking the inverted figure of the hangman tarot card. The body was naked, its face covered in plastic and duct tape, secured with wire that had been used to silence them, life from him. The task was physically and psychologically demanding.
The young operative, with his bolt cutters, had to figure out how to safely retrieve the body. A silent body is an unnervingly heavy weight, pure, uncooperative, dead weight. The challenge was not simply cutting the wire, but ensuring the body did not fall onto the street below. They eventually managed to position a flatbed truck beneath the bridge, gently lowering the corpse onto the surface. As the operative descended from the bridge, he found himself overwhelmed by the cognitive dissonance of the scene. He was in a profound state of shock and horror. His partner, the older veteran, stood smoking a cigarette, utterly calm, exchanging phone numbers with a forensic lady. The operative's immediate reaction was one of moral outrage. He expressed his horror. The older cop's reply, delivered with cold, dismissive patience, was the second devastating lesson of the day. "What's wrong, new guy?" "They're being kind." The kindness, the older cop explained, lay in the fact that the body had been left at all. In Tijuana, the violence was so pervasive, the methods of disposal so absolute, that most families never received a body to mourn or bury. This was a city where rivals would often dissolve bodies in caustic soda, reducing them to nothingness. The act of leaving a body to be found, therefore, was a perverse act of kindness. The sheer volume of this hidden war was staggering. In the year 2004, Tijuana was officially deemed the most dangerous city on the planet by numbers. A regular night might yield 5 or 6 bodies that suffered a fatal outcome in various locations across the city. But this count only included the bodies found. On top of this visible mortality were the disappearances and the abductions for ransom, which were rampant during this period. The high frequency of these abductions created a massive exodus of wealth from the city. Business owners, fearing for their lives, began moving their operations and families north to San Diego. The constant acts of finality were fueled by the underlying economic engine of the cartel war. The fighting between the Arellano Félix organization and the newly arriving Sinaloa cartel was a brutal, strategic turf war, focusing on the most exposed elements of the enemy's business, the sales points. This fact underscores a critical truth. A large part of the violence in Mexico is driven not by American demand, but by the internal fight for control over domestic illicit product markets and protection rackets. To affect a rival's business, a cartel would target the sales points, terminate the police officers who were on the take and working for the other side, and burn businesses under the rival's protection rackets. This is the mechanism by which the city was plunged into chaos. The young operative, now fully initiated, realized his place in this equation. He was now a target in a war that targeted cops on the take. His clean slate was his only temporary shield. He was one of the 20 operativos in a city of millions, tasked with fighting a battle that the army was barely beginning to understand. The armory in the safe house. The rules dissolve. When a raid led the operative into the hidden sanctuary of the enemy, he discovered not only the grotesque scale of their terror, but the profound corruption of his own allies. The division between right and wrong was not a fixed line of morality, but a bizarre, fluid space where the spoils of war were openly traded. The initial call that led to this discovery was precipitated by an act of finality. Municipal police officers were terminated, and the trail of the assailants led the operativos and their army counterparts to a cluster of houses. This type of lead, where one crime spiraled into a deeper, interconnected rat's nest of criminal activity, was common. One house led to another until they located a safe house used by the organized crime groups. The setting of the safe house was a contradiction. A seemingly ordinary residence located within an upper-class neighborhood. The approach to the house was tense, but the house was silent upon entry. The criminals had been tipped off, escaping through a back ladder, leaving their operational base intact. Inside, the house was a chilling testament to the banality of terror. There were mattresses scattered across the floor and makeshift surveillance systems, simple baby monitors improvised into a security network. The initial work required of the operative was meticulous. Site exploitation, gathering all evidence into a bag. But as he focused on his task, he began to notice a profound shift in the behavior of his allies. The army personnel were nowhere to be seen. As the operative moved into the next room, the air of normal criminality dissolved entirely, replaced by a sight of almost cinematic horror. He walked into a room that contained nothing less than a full, undisturbed armory. The sheer scale of the firepower defied belief. Weapons were stacked floor to ceiling. Barrett 50 caliber anti-material rifles lay against the walls, alongside countless AK-style rifles, P90 submachine guns, and massive piles of magazines. The operative, armed only with his basic AR-15, was overwhelmed. He was supposed to be the tip of the spear, yet he stood in a room of weapons that outnumbered his entire unit. His initial instinct was to treat the scene as evidence, taking pictures. It was at this moment that the system failed completely. The army soldiers suddenly converged on the armory. They did not move to secure the evidence. Instead, they began to strip the rifles for parts. The realization was immediate and profound. This was not a professional law enforcement action, but a looting opportunity. The army viewed the cartel armory as a logistical resupply point. The operative was forced to make an instant, agonizing moral decision. The rules he had been trained to uphold were meaningless. He saw the army personnel kitting up, equipping themselves with gear stripped from the enemy's stockpile. He joined them, acknowledging the harsh, immediate reality. The rules don't apply here. The descent into the absurd continued. He went downstairs, following the soldiers, and found them not securing the perimeter, but in the kitchen, casually eating abalone out of cans they had found. The operative, unable to process the profound systemic compromise, silently piled into the back of the army Humvee and left for the next house. This raid revealed the true, complex nature of the enemy they faced. The cartel's fighting force was largely composed of kids, young men, often American gang members brought in from Los Angeles, who were recruited to form small, isolated cells. The survival rate for these young fighters was incredibly low. He recounts the discovery of a single, horrific mass grave, 12 bodies that suffered a fatal outcome left on the roadside. All young men from the same city block. The victims were often silenced with wire to minimize noise and left in their underwear on the roadside. The oldest of these young men was 19, the youngest only 14 or 15. This was the true, tragic face of the war. Not an army of hardened professionals, but disposable youth. However, amidst this wave of foot soldiers, the operative would occasionally encounter a true professional, a hitter. He recalls one such confrontation in the Zona Norte area of Tijuana, where a cartel member, engaged in a shootout, systematically eliminated his 4 assailants, terminated 2 police officers while fleeing, and crashed his vehicle. This professional killer, captured and handcuffed to a Red Cross gurney, was later identified as a former member of the Mexican Army's Air Mobile Special Forces Group, GAFE. This man was bilingual, highly trained in precision shooting. He was a professional eliminator, former soldier, whose training had been seamlessly transferred to the service of organized crime. The presence of the professional killer, coupled with the open mooting by his own military allies, forced a final, irreversible decision upon the young operative. The line of ethical conduct was a weird place where the army acted as thieves and the police were forced to improvise their honor. His survival depended entirely on his own ability to maintain discipline in an environment that had none. The Mogadishu Ball, first firefight, and adrenaline. The call came for an abduction in progress, a reckless, immediate response driven by young motivation. It led to a sound that deafens the soul, a chaos of bullets, and the chilling realization that war is less like a film and more like a paralyzing, erratic dance. The event began with a report of an abduction in progress. A group of suburbans had picked up an individual in downtown Tijuana. The call, broadcast over the police radio system,
Comando C4, immediately went out.
In Tijuana, the local police, compromised and paid by the cartels, heard the call and made an immediate choice. They stayed home. Nobody would show up, except for the experimental police force. The small contingent of operativos, driven by youth, purpose, and profound inexperience, heard the call and made the illogical decision to respond immediately. The math was devastatingly simple. 4 or 5 men going up against an estimated 40 or more armed individuals. But it was ignored. The young operative, only a few months into his active service, chose to ride in the back of the truck. His primary weapon was a Colt AR-15, backed by only 3 magazines. They approached an intersection and saw the targets moving slowly. The men inside the up-armored Suburbans, recognizing the police truck, did not hesitate. They showed the wooden stocks of their AK-47s and pointed their weapons toward the officers. The driver reached for his radio when Ed screamed at him to stay put. The cartel vehicles passed, choosing not to engage immediately. They moved further down the road, and that is when the shooting began. The young operative was instantly plunged into a maelstrom of violence. The sound of rifles being fired nearby and directed at him was a physical act of violation that destroyed the world's equilibrium. The first rounds were loud, deafening, tearing the sound from his ears. The subsequent rounds, due to the auditory damage, were only perceived as a muffled ringing, a sense of being perpetually underwater. Communication was impossible. He felt a profound physiological confusion. He was lost, disoriented, unable to determine where the front was back. His academy training battled his animal instinct to recoil, creating a debilitating stiffness in his hands and knees. His jaw was locked, and his muscles were seized into a ball of tension. He looked around for directions. In the chaos, there was no command structure. The army, also present, was equally confused. Finally, seeing the men around him firing toward a general direction, he made the only logical choice. I said, let's just shoot that general direction. This type of combat, known as Mogadishu shooting, was defined by erratic, chaotic fire. The young operative experienced a strange cold sweat and a weird metallic almond sense and taste in your nose, the unique sensation of extreme fear. The battle ended not with a clear victory, but with the cartel vehicles scattering and dissolving into the traffic. The physiological aftermath of the battle was immediate and brutal. The extreme release of toxins and adrenaline triggered severe diarrhea a few hours later. The emotional release was a nervous, high-tension laughter. The fundamental flaw in the force's deployment was the absence of immediate functioning leadership. The army, their primary ally, was equally confused. This dangerous lack of structure persisted until the arrival of the only man capable of imposing his will, Lieutenant Colonel Lirola. Lirola's first day as the new director was a seismic event. He showed up like a Gordon Ramsay of law enforcement, immediately scrutinizing everything. He viewed the problem of cartel violence in Tijuana not as a traditional policing issue, but as a counter-insurgency problem. His first act of leadership was to establish a coordinated security table, forcing all the key power figures to gather and agree upon a single point of authority: himself. The objective was control, preventing either of the two warring cartels from achieving absolute dominion. Irola's strategic mind quickly identified the main support system of the cartels, the Tijuana Municipal Police. They served as the criminals' primary intelligence service and their operational arm. Recognizing the local police as the most valuable tool for controlling the city's power dynamics, he maneuvered himself into the position of head of the Tijuana Municipal Police. This act was a direct declaration of war, making him a marked man. He faced 9 assassination attempts over the course of his career, the last of which cost him the use of his legs, forcing him into a wheelchair. The strategy to cleanse the municipal force was as direct as it was ruthless. He instituted the same rigorous certification and confidence exams that had filtered the experimental police. The result was massive attrition. Officers who were compromised immediately quit rather than face scrutiny. Others were subtly forced out. An officer known to work for one cartel would be intentionally transferred to the precinct controlled by the rival cartel, forcing his immediate resignation. The result was an astonishing act. The entire municipal police force of Tijuana was disarmed. Their weapons were put through forensic analysis, and many were found to have been used in acts of finality, officially issued firearms used for cartel hits. The total disarming of the police had a dramatic effect. The municipal police were forced to walk their beats with only slingshots as a symbol of protest. The vacuum was filled by the experimental force and the army, who temporarily became the local police. The changes under Lirola were evident not in the number of unnatural cessations of existence, which remained high, but in the change in behavior of the cartels. They were forced to hide. They switched from conspicuous armored cars to cloned police vehicles, and eventually to more discreet vehicles like taxis. The young operative, having survived the chaos of his first firefight, was now under the direct command of the only man who truly understood the nature of the conflict. The quiet strength of command had finally replaced the screaming chaos of the streets. The counter-insurgent, Lirola takes command. Order arrived in the form of the colonel himself, a man who saw the city's plight not as a simple crime problem, but as a political military sickness, a complex strategic infection. He was a force of nature, an absolute commander who understood that the true foundation of the cartel's power was the local police itself. The colonel's arrival was not subtle. It was immediate, decisive, and terrifyingly clear. He showed up to the command center like a single-minded force, operating with the intense scrutiny of a military inspector. Ed Calderon recalls his presence as that of a Gordon Ramsay, a commander who instantly identified every flaw, every lapse in discipline, and every piece of broken or unauthorized equipment. He immediately began to cut off excess, demanding that weapons be fixed, that uniforms be standardized, and that the fundamental discipline of the unit be restored. His first strategic act upon taking command was to select a personal driver and bodyguard. He did not ask for volunteers in a traditional manner. Instead, he simply pointed at the young operative, Ed Calderon, declaring, "Who wants to be my bodyguard?" One step forward. This choice immediately placed the young man at the epicenter of the strategic war, driving Lirola through the streets of Tijuana
on his first day as the new director of the entire security operation. Lirola's background was formidable. He was a seasoned army officer, a graduate of a war college, and a veteran of Operation Condor, the first major operation to eradicate illicit crops in the Sinaloa region during his youth. This experience gave him a unique perspective. He viewed the criminal problem not through the lens of a local police chief, but through the calculating, cold gaze of a military strategist. His most critical strategic reframing of the conflict was encapsulated in a single defining declaration. This is not a policing problem. Lirola correctly identified the cartel's operations as a counterinsurgency problem. He declared that they would operate using counterinsurgency tactics, a classification that elevated the criminal groups to the status of a military threat and altered the entire method of engagement. To execute this strategy, Lirola first needed to establish absolute command. He organized a central coordination table of security, forcing all the key power figures of the region, the head of the army, the municipal police chief, the governor, and the municipal president to gather. In this single meeting, he forced a consensus, establishing himself as the undisputed authority in charge of the entire war effort. He now had the essential resources: the backing of the political establishment, the full resources of the military, and the financial support of the private sector, which was desperate for order. The objective of the war, as defined by Lirola, was not to install a single winner, but to prevent either of the two warring entities, the Arellano Félix organization and the Sinaloa cartel, from gaining absolute control of Tijuana. The strategy was to create a blanket, relentless pressure that forced both groups into retreat and disorder. In executing this counterinsurgency, Lirola made a terrifying, profound realization. The main support system, the literal operational arm of the cartels in Tijuana, was the Tijuana Municipal Police. The Municipal Police were the eyes, ears, and local intelligence service of the criminal organizations. They provided the essential, minute-by-minute street knowledge, allowing the cartels to move openly and operate with impunity. The corruption was not monolithic. It was distributed. Different police precincts were on the payroll of different cartels, creating a decentralized network of protection that made effective federal intervention impossible. Lirola understood that this local force, the cop on the street corner, was infinitely more valuable to the cartels than any visiting federal agent who lacked local knowledge and would inevitably leave. The local police were the valuable tool that sustained the criminal ecosystem. The colonel's genius lay in his decision to eliminate this systemic flaw from within. He found a way to have himself named the head of the Tijuana Municipal Police. This act was a direct, formal declaration of war against the most powerful, protected corruption network in the city. It immediately made him a high-value target. Lirola would go on to survive 9 assassination attempts on his life, a testament to the deadly offense his mere existence posed to the criminal and political interests he was attacking. His survival of this sustained campaign of violence was itself a mythological feat, though one of the attempts ultimately left him confined to a wheelchair. With control of the municipal police, Lirola initiated a systematic, brutal purge of the ranks, applying the same uncompromising standards he had used in the academy. All officers were subjected to the rigorous certification and confidence exams, psychological tests, polygraphs, and background checks. This process immediately forced a massive, critical wave of resignations. Officers who were compromised, knowing they could not pass the lie detector tests or background checks,
quit immediately rather than face scrutiny. For those who did not quit, Lirola implemented a brilliant, simple stratagem of internal sabotage. If a police precinct was known to be run by a cartel operative, Lirola would intentionally transfer that precinct chief and his men to an area controlled by the rival cartel. The chief, knowing he would be immediately terminated by the rival organization for being a foreign agent, would be forced to quit to save his own life. This systematic, strategic use of betrayal and fear cleaned the ranks. The result was an astonishing, unprecedented act. The entire municipal police force of Tijuana was disarmed. Their weapons, every single officially issued firearm, were seized and put through forensic analysis. The analysis revealed the stunning depth of the corruption. A lot of the officially issued firearms were found to have been used in acts of finality, confirming that police weapons were routinely being used by cartel assassins. The total disarming of the local police, a move that would be unthinkable in almost any other country, was a desperate, necessary measure. The municipal police, as a sign of protest, were reduced to walking their beats with only slingshots, a pathetic symbol of their loss of authority. This vacuum of local law enforcement was immediately filled by the colonel's forces. The experimental police unit and the army were deployed as the temporary de facto local police, covering the massive territory abandoned by the corrupt officers. The operation was a success. Lirola had fundamentally changed the power dynamic of the city. He had broken the main support system of the cartels. The effect of Lirola's changes manifested not necessarily in an immediate drop in the number of unnatural cessations of existence, which remained high, but in the change in behavior of the cartels. This behavioral shift was the true measure of their success. The armed convoys that once openly drove through the main avenues, flaunting their wealth and power, were now forced to hide. They retreated from public view, realizing that the new authority was organized, disciplined, and utterly incorruptible. The cartels began to change their operational tactics. They abandoned the conspicuous, up-armored sport utility vehicles and began to use cloned police vehicles to maintain an air of legitimacy. Eventually, as pressure mounted, they shifted to even more discreet methods, using unmarked, common taxis for transport. Lirola was so successful that he was later tasked with implementing the same strategy in Ciudad Juarez, another city that had been brought to its knees by cartel warfare. He achieved similar results there, proving that his counterinsurgency model could work if the political will and resources were aligned. However, the nature of corruption in Mexico is not merely criminal. It is political. And political allegiance is a fickle thing. After Lirola left his post, the political administration changed hands. The people he had arrested, the corrupt police officers and their political allies, who now viewed him as a profound enemy, used their connections to retaliate. A standing arrest warrant was eventually issued for Lirola, forcing the colonel, who had saved 2 cities, to go into hiding. The victorious soldiers, including Ed Calderon, were immediately vilified. The political narrative of the new administration required a scapegoat, and the successful effort to quell the violence, representing the politics of the previous government, was declared an enemy. All the hard-won professionalism, the polygraphs, the background checks, the certification, were declared unconstitutional and eventually stopped. The successful unit became a villain in the new political regime. This forced Ed Calderon, along with many of his colleagues, to leave the job. He had dedicated years of his life to fighting corruption and chaos, only to find himself driven out by the very political system he was meant to be serving. The young operative, now a seasoned commander, was left with the cold realization that the fight was not just against the cartels, but against the endless, cyclical betrayal of the state itself. The fast and furious river of iron, US gun flow. Even as the local forces fought to stem the tide, a larger, invisible corruption fueled the fire. A policy enacted by a foreign power allowed a torrent of high-powered, untraceable weapons to flow directly into the hands of the very enemy they sought to destroy. The price of this iron river was paid in blood on both sides of the border. The young operative, Ed Calderon, along with his colleagues, was perpetually under-equipped, armed with only a handful of magazines and often a semi-automatic weapon. Yet the cartels they fought possessed an ever-increasing arsenal of sophisticated, high-end firearms that were clearly of American origin. This influx of weapons was not random. It was a constant, deliberate resupply, largely fueled by a network of straw purchases in the United States. Before this period, the guns recovered from cartel operations were typically civilian AR-style rifles, stolen or captured police and military weapons, and older Soviet bloc Kalashnikovs. Then, an astonishing immediate shift occurred. The operatives suddenly began encountering high-end, specialized firearms, never before seen on the streets. These included FN-57 pistols, known colloquially as cop killer guns, because of their ability to fire a high-velocity, small-caliber round designed to pierce certain types of body armor. Even more terrifying was the appearance of Barrett 50-caliber anti-materiel rifles, weapons designed not for engaging infantry, but for piercing armored vehicles. The presence of these rifles, often still in their original boxes, was a clear signal that the cartels had targeted the newly acquired armored personnel carriers and vehicles used by Lirola's forces. Every piece of this advanced arsenal was stamped with its origin. The rifles were covered in American tactical accessories from premier brands, customized gear that was in vogue among firearm enthusiasts in the United States. The weapons were brand-name, coveted pieces that could only have been sourced from north of the border. They were being purchased through straw purchases, where seemingly clean second- or third-generation Mexican Americans or full-time cartel operatives living in the United States would acquire the weapons legally and then smuggle them south. This systemic flow was tied to a profound political and intelligence scandal known as Operation Fast and Furious. The federal agency was deliberately allowing large straw purchases of firearms, knowing the shopping lists were destined for the Sinaloa cartel. The tracking failed completely. The ATF simply observed and recorded the sales, overriding the concerns of the gun dealers, and then allowed the weapons to walk across the border into Mexico. This catastrophic failure meant that hundreds of powerful, untraceable American firearms were delivered directly into the hands of the cartels. The consequences of this betrayal were paid for in the lives of the law enforcement community on both sides of the border. The young operative vividly recalls the first time his unit encountered the FN-57 pistol. Two young cartel members showed up at the home of one of his colleagues, an officer who was leaving his house with his wife and young daughter in the back seat. Using the high-velocity pistols, the assailants inflicted a fatal outcome on the officer and his wife, and the officer's daughter lost an arm in the assassination attempt. The political scandal in the United States only broke because one of the Fast and Furious guns was used to terminate Brian Terry, a federal agent working near the border. His unnatural cessation of existence brought the scandal to the forefront. But as Ed Calderon keenly observes, while Agent Terry's passing into finality was a great tragedy, there were a bunch of my friends silenced too, and nobody knows anything about them. The high-velocity rounds from these pistols were also devastating to the general populace. He recounts the story of a lady who was purchasing reading glasses in a shop, silenced by a stray round that pierced a car. These were the collateral tragedies of a foreign policy failure. The flow of American firearms into Mexico never truly stopped. The weapons remain a constant primary source of revenue and payment for the cartels. Guns, rifles, and bullets are used as a form of currency in Mexico, paying off debts. This perpetual availability of US firearms ensures that the cartels maintain their military advantage over the local police. The cartel's business model evolved rapidly. The young operative notes that during the COVID-19 pandemic, it was ironically cheaper to buy 9mm ammunition on the black market in Mexico than in the United States. The cartels had been stockpiling vast amounts of rounds, demonstrating their readiness for conflict. The systemic nature of the corruption and the flow of weapons were tragically intertwined with the failure of the Mexican state to protect its own citizens' rights. The Mexican Constitution technically includes the right to bear arms. However, this constitutional right is rendered entirely moot by a massive federal firearms law that is rigorously enforced by the Mexican army. This military control has slowly, systematically suppressed the populace's right to self-defense. The number of gun stores in Mexico has dwindled to just one, which is controlled by the military. The process of legally acquiring a gun is prohibitively expensive. The benefit of keeping the populace unarmed is clear. An unarmed populace is the easiest to control and maintain. This policy created an immense moral conflict for the young operative. During eradication operations in remote areas, he would encounter ranch houses owned by families with no cartel ties, who possessed hunting rifles for their own protection. He would quietly empty the bullets and put them in a bag, leaving the guns behind, recognizing that he could not strip an honest citizen of their only means of self-defense. This internal line was a critical moral boundary he would not cross. The flow of weapons was also intricately tied to the technology of smuggling. Tijuana was the Wakanda of the smuggling world, specializing in the construction of clavos, or traps, sophisticated hidden compartments in vehicles. The rollers' forces were only able to begin cracking these clavos by recruiting associates of the people who built them. The weapons, once smuggled, were part of a massive, terrifying machine that included the occasional use of advanced, often Chinese-made technology. The operative recalls the first time he encountered a large, crashed quadcopter drone near the port of entry. The drone was massive, containing a large brick of crystal methamphetamine, a clear signal that the cartels were already experimenting with advanced aerial smuggling techniques. The war was a conflict of profound contradictions. A small, incorruptible police force fighting a highly organized, heavily armed enemy that was continuously being supplied and resourced by the country whose aid was meant to be supporting them. The young operative, having witnessed the systemic corruption of his own allies and the catastrophic betrayal of his foreign ally, was now armed with the cold, necessary knowledge of his own expendability. The arrival of the American iron was a devastating indictment of the system that permitted the war to continue. The new plague, from weed to powder and pill presses. The American demand for marijuana, once the lifeblood of the cartels, shifted to a new, more lethal need. The ground beneath the poppy fields changed, and a lighter, deadlier powder arrived, transforming the business into a pharmaceutical nightmare. The old engine of commerce had found a faster, more destructive fuel. For decades, The foundation of the cartel's revenue rested heavily on illicit product sales into the United States, accounting for an estimated 60% of their illicit commerce income. However, the rapid legalization and decriminalization of marijuana across the U.S. delivered an economic shock. The cartels did not collapse. They simply adapted with speed. The fields that once grew marijuana were swiftly converted to a more lethal crop, opium poppy. The harvest would be refined into heroin, a more potent and profitable product. The pipeline that had once carried marijuana north now carried guns south and heroin north. The legalization of marijuana led to the immediate observation of an uptick in heroin being moved across the border. But the true transformation came with the ascent of synthetic substances, particularly fentanyl. The young operative and his colleagues began to see substances that they initially confused with methamphetamine or its precursors. There was a growing awareness of a powerful new opioid on the scene. The intelligence that emerged began to paint a terrifying picture of industrial-scale chemical operations. They were utilizing sophisticated pill presses to create synthetic opioid pills, a technique that drastically reduced the volume required for smuggling and dramatically increased the profit margin. The early intelligence on this synthetic shift revealed that the cartels were utilizing legal channels related to Mexico's large pharmaceutical industry to bring in the necessary precursor chemicals. This reliance on legal commerce was brought into the spotlight by the high-profile arrest of a Chinese-Mexican businessman who was found with over $100 million in cash. The cartels began experimenting aggressively. There were reports of local illicit product markets where low-quality heroin was being laced with fentanyl. The most terrifying intelligence involved the weaponization of the substance itself. This intelligence suggested that a criminal organization utilized fentanyl to eliminate the homeless population in a certain area. The strategy was horrifyingly calculated. The cartel would temporarily lower the potency of their street illicit product for a month, allowing tolerances to drop. Then they would aggressively increase the potency, lacing the heroin with fentanyl and causing mass cessations of existence. This act served a dual purpose, eliminating an undesirable population and controlling the market. The broader economic lesson was clear. The cartels were ready for legalization. They had already diversified their portfolios, establishing themselves in real estate, mining, protection rackets, and the illegal trade of stolen gasoline. Whatever killing blow the legalization was expected to deliver was entirely absorbed. The shift to fentanyl signaled a new era in the war, one defined by chemical control and international supply chains. The new generation cartel was suspected of having profound connections to China, the source of many precursor chemicals. The strategic consequences of the shift were immense. Fentanyl allowed the cartels to bypass many of the old logistical hurdles. It was so potent that massive amounts of profit could be condensed into small packets. The operative also reflects on the rise of a new, terrifying substance culture in the United States, one defined by paranoia and lethality. The high probability of a fatal dose of fentanyl is, ironically, the most effective prevention messaging ever created. The grim, long-term consequence of this shift is the loss of an entire generation of young people. The overwhelming lethality of fentanyl is creating a massive hole in the demographic fabric of both Mexico and the United States. The young operative understood that the war had become a battle against an invisible molecular enemy. The conflict was now defined by a global reach. The cartels were no longer just a Mexican problem.
They were an international threat that had mastered modern chemistry and logistics. The Trapped Man, Suicide Watch, and the Cost of Survival. For all the thunder and fire of the war, the true damage was done in the silence, the immense psychological cost exacted by the constant proximity to cessation of existence and absolute horror. The official therapy for men who had seen heads used as soccer balls was a six-pack, a self-termination watch, and a single unspoken agreement to keep each other's guns. The psychological toll of fighting the cartel war was immense, yet it was completely unsupported by the institutions the operatives served. The concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was not recognized, and the system offered absolutely no mental health support. The men were left to manage the unimaginable horrors they witnessed with a primitive, dangerous self-medication. Ed Calderon and his colleagues were repeatedly exposed to scenes of raw, spectacular violence. He recalls one such event, the second prison riot in Tijuana. The inmates were shooting from the inside out. The operative vividly recalls the sight of the inmates playing soccer with a head in the prison football field. Rival cartel members had been burned alive. After the pacification of such an event, the state offered no debriefing. The commander in charge simply pulled out a six-pack of beer. That was the therapy, the operative notes. The official guideline was to drink it into oblivion. This culture of self-medication became an immediate and essential part of the operational structure. The protocol was to have a buddy system. If a comrade was exhibiting despair or signs of self-inflicted fate, he was immediately attached to a partner. That partner's singular job was to grab you and take you out drinking. But this act of alcoholic camaraderie carried a profound, life-saving corollary. The partner was also tasked with quietly taking his comrade's gun away once he was drunk. The act of drinking was a shared descent into temporary madness. The act of removing the weapon was a recognition of the prevalence of self-termination within the ranks. For Ed Calderon, the culture fostered a deep, personal alcoholism. The profound realization of his own psychological damage only arrived much later, when he was forced to leave the force and sought refuge in the United States. Living near the military community, he began to hear new clinical words like TSD, TBIs, alcoholism, and depression. Hearing these words, he realized that the issues he had dealt with, the constant nervousness, the need for immediate oblivion, were not normal. His abnormal survival culture was starkly contrasted with a society that acknowledged need for mental health support. The culture of the Mexican police force added to this burden. The profession carried an immense social and economic stigma. The operative notes that the social perception of a cop is immediately one of corruption. This stigma created massive, real-world obstacles. A cop could not secure credit for a car, a house, or a basic credit card from a bank. This systemic financial ostracization forced honest officers into a state of continuous financial need, making them even more vulnerable to the vast financial offers of the cartels. Furthermore, the police were given almost no rights. If an officer left the force, even for legitimate reasons, he was often automatically disqualified from joining any other police agency in all of Mexico, a process that felt like a vendetta. In the years following the operative's departure, the situation has worsened. The brief era of professionalism under Lirola was undone by political shifts. What had been a focused command center was reverted to a military barracks, a crude patrolling model where soldiers ride in the back of electric trucks. The core of the issue remains the deep-seated cultural stigma coupled with a systemic denial of rights and financial stability to the police force. The nation is now on a path toward what the operative views as a military dictatorship with a narco base. The true, invisible cost of the war was thus the souls of the men who fought it. They survived the bullets only to be betrayed by their own government. The quiet resolution he eventually found in the United States, the ability to name his pain, was a peace that many of his comrades would never achieve. The rhyme of history: exile in the looming military state. The colonel's victory, though successful, was ultimately undone by the changing wind of politics. The heroes became the villains, the truth became the lie, and the men who fought the war were exiled, leaving behind a nation that is now slowly, irrevocably, slipping toward a different, more pervasive kind of authority. The tragic cycle of Mexico, the inescapable truth that political expediency will always triumph over justice, ensured that the problems of the past were never truly solved. Lieutenant Colonel Larola's strategic success was undeniable. However, once he left and the political administration changed hands, the narrative of his success was immediately targeted for destruction. The successful counterinsurgent was immediately designated an enemy of the state. The people Larola had arrested used their renewed influence to strike back. A standing arrest warrant was eventually issued for the colonel, forcing the man who had saved 2 cities to go into hiding. The fate of the officers who had served under him was equally grim. The successful experimental unit was collectively vilified. The political shift ensured that the police force was dismantled. All the hard-won professionalism, the certification, polygraphs, the background checks were declared unconstitutional and eventually stopped. Ed Calderon, witnessing the systematic dismantling of his life's purpose, was forced to leave the job. The financial pressure was immense as the government delayed or withheld the promised liquidation money, underscoring the profound contempt the system held for its own defenders. This betrayal created a terrifying vacuum. The experienced, incorruptible former officers were no longer working for the state. The government's systemic failure to honor its law enforcement officers ensures that this specialized knowledge is pushed into a space where it is easily acquired by the criminal element. The current political reality, defined by the left-wing Morena Party, presents a profound crisis. The operative views the current state as a straight path toward a profound institutional collapse. Mexico is heading toward a military dictatorship with a narco base. This assessment is based on a series of profound, visible shifts in power dynamics. The army is rapidly assuming control of essential civilian infrastructure. The National Guard units are army personnel in disguise, and political consolidation ensures an unchecked grip on power. The highest levels of government corruption remain untouchable. The targeted arrests that do make the headlines are often linked to instances of military vengeance or are strategically timed around election season to create a public perception that the government is effectively fighting the cartels. The great danger is that the Mexican state is rapidly adopting the characteristics of a failed, autocratic state. The destination for this political trajectory is similar to Venezuela. This instability, coupled with Mexico's massive economic potential, often referred to as the next China, creates an immense geopolitical vulnerability. This entire systemic failure is sustained by a profound denial of reality and a resistance to honest solutions. The idea of full illicit commerce legalization is dismissed as logistically impossible for a country like Mexico. Furthermore, the cartels are already so diversified that legalization would merely eliminate a revenue stream, not the organizations themselves. The solution, the operative concludes, is tied to a collective, unwavering commitment to 3 core principles.
demand for accountability for U.S. taxpayer money sent to Mexico. Dialogue and inclusion with honest individuals who have fought the war. And an end to the cycle of betrayal by providing the police force with rights and financial stability. The operative's story is a profound personal testimony to the collapse of a nation's soul. He chose the most difficult path, found his purpose, and was ultimately forced into exile, realizing that he had not been fighting merely the cartel, but the deeply entrenched, self-perpetuating corruption of the state. The war, he observes, does not truly repeat itself, but it always rhymes. The young operative, now safe, carries the knowledge of that deep corruption and the whispered oracle of his friend. He survived the violence, but he remains a testament to the tragic, eternal failure of the system to protect its own. His journey is a final, urgent warning. The storm that once broke Tijuana is merely a localized version of the profound structural crisis now enveloping the entire nation. The silence after the storm. The narrative now concludes, drawing the final curtain on the shadow war fought along the border. A conflict where the individual will battle the overwhelming, cyclical force of political and criminal corruption. We leave the city of Tijuana, no longer with the roaring sound of gunfire, but with the quiet, lingering echo of lessons learned and battles survived. Good evening. The journey ends here, but the truths we have uncovered, the cold clarity of fate, the high cost of principle, and the quiet betrayal of systems remain within the stillness of the nape mind. Allow the turbulent rhythms of the story to now settle, like dust after a desert storm, leaving behind only the solid ground of understanding. The story of the operative, Ed Calderon, is not merely a tale of a war. It is a profound meditation on the tension between chaos and order, a struggle that is both personal and ancient. We began in the void of Cartonlandia. We watched as that home's fragile order was shattered by a single seismic tragedy, the loss of the brother, forcing a young man to be cast into a directionless youth. He found that structure in the crucible of Lirola's experimental police force. The price of entry was the dissolution of self. The selection process sought to eliminate vulnerability, to find the unattached soul who would not be easily bought or broken by the cartels. The institution demanded a warrior free from ties, a soldier who could not be leveraged. Yet, even within this chosen order, the pervasive nature of corruption revealed itself immediately. The gas station oracle whispered a warning of fate. His initiation was sealed by the grotesque, haunting sign of the hangman on the pedestrian bridge. The illusion of clean authority was utterly dissolved during the raid on the armory in the safe house. The violence was physical, paralyzing, and defined by fear. The first firefight, the Mogadishu Ball, left him physically seized and psychologically broken. Order finally arrived in the form of Lieutenant Colonel Lirola, who reframed the chaos as a counterinsurgency, dismantling their nervous system, the Tijuana Municipal Police. Yet, even as this local order was established, a greater geopolitical betrayal was underway. The fast and furious River of Iron flowed unchecked from the north, arming the cartels with the high-velocity weapons needed to defeat the new police. The enemy itself evolved, marking the cartel's pivot to synthetic poison. The physical and moral costs accumulated until they became unbearable. The final chapter of the war was the psychological trauma, the culture of the trapped man. who managed his exposure to horrors with self-medication. The final betrayal was political. The colonel was made a fugitive, and the honest officers were driven out, their sacrifice discarded. The nation's current path is one of profound regression, the slow, visible march toward a military dictatorship with a narco base. This entire narrative, therefore, is a testament to the endurance of the individual will against an overwhelming systemic fate. He survived the violence, but he remains a testament to the tragic, eternal failure of the system to protect its own. Allow this profound complexity to now settle. Let the images of chaos, the smoke, the gunfire, the betrayal, recede into the distance of memory. The work is done, the story has been told, and the necessary truths have been revealed. Now, let the spirit of the narrative guide you inward, toward a deeper understanding of the sanctuary.
You are now building for your own mind. The operative's journey, though filled with external threats, was ultimately a search for internal order. The chaos he faced, the violence, the corruption, the political betrayal, is but a magnified reflection of the chaos we all carry. The relentless pressures of debt, the anxieties of the future, the unshakable weight of past mistakes. These are your personal cartels, forces that seek to seize control of your peace. Tonight, you have chosen to place those forces outside the walls of your awareness. Think of the rhythm of this voice as the steady hand of Lirola, imposing order on the screaming confusion. The cadence is deliberate, slow, and measured, acknowledging the details of the fear without ever surrendering to its urgency. This consistent pace is a deliberate act of resistance against the modern world's frantic demand for attention and alarm. You are choosing the slow breath over the quickened heart. The lesson of the clean slate is a powerful one to carry into your rest. The recruiters sought a young man unburdened by ties, uncorrected by history. Tonight, you too can become a clean slate. Release the judgments of the day, the arguments that occurred, the emails left unanswered, the expectations that weighed heavily. These are the attachments that make you vulnerable to the external chaos. In the profound darkness of your resting space, your mind is being reset, washed clean by the flowing waters of forgetfulness. Do not be afraid of the darkness that is now encompassing you. The operative frequently operated in the shadow, where the greatest lessons were learned. In the armory, in the abandoned safe houses, under the bridge where the hangman's sign was posted. The subconscious mind, active now, is your own uncharted territory. It is in this profound absence of light and distraction that your mind begins its truest work, not fighting, but healing. It is processing the traumas and integrating the complexities of your waking life into a framework of quiet understanding. As you feel your body grow heavy, consider the immense betrayal of the system that forced good men to become vulnerable. The operative was denied simple financial stability and mental health support, pushing him into a dependence on crude coping mechanisms. Recognize the value of the support systems you do have, the quiet comforts of your home, the loyalty of your own chosen community, the simple act of self-care you are performing right now by seeking this rest. These are your true pillars, the anti-corruption units of your private life. The struggle the operative faced was against a system that rewarded political theater, the showy, empty arrests, over profound, difficult change, Lirola's surgical cleansing.
In your own life, you are choosing the profound change, the difficult, necessary act of clearing your mind over the easy distraction of noise. This choice is a testament to your quiet strength, your commitment to your own lasting peace. You are not just resting, you are participating in an active healing process. Let the words of the narrative now dissolve into the background hum of your own inner peace. Allow the final truths to be integrated into the deep, quiet rhythm of your breathing. The danger is gone. The decisions are postponed. The only task remaining is to drift. Feel the profound weight of your limbs on the surface that supports you. Imagine that the heavy, rhythmic beat of your heart is the steady drum of a process that is working for your renewal. You are not a spectator. You are the master of this silence. You possess this space, this time, and this peace absolutely. There are no more checkpoints, no more interrogations, and no more threats. The gate is closed, and you are secure within the walls of your own awareness. Breathe in the tranquility. Breathe out the last vestiges of resistance. The finality of sleep is not a cessation of existence, but an essential, sacred passage into the restorative hours of the night. Surrender to it completely, knowing that the structural integrity of your soul is being silently fortified with every slow, deliberate breath. The Deep Current, Reflections on Fate and Structure. As you sink deeper into the quiet, allow the themes of the narrative to transform from memory into a guiding philosophy for your rest. The most persistent theme woven throughout the operative's life was the rhyme of history. The chaos of the childhood home gave way to the chaos of the Zeta's training, which led to the chaos of the streets, and ultimately to the chaos of political betrayal. The problems never truly disappeared. They simply returned in a new, more technologically advanced form. But you, at this moment, are choosing to break the rhyme. By seeking deep, structured rest, you are refusing to let the anxieties of yesterday dictate the readiness of tomorrow. You are deliberately injecting order into the cycle of strain. The stillness of your body is the most powerful counterinsurgency you can wage against the noise of the external world. Reflect on the power of the unseen. In Tijuana, the greatest threats were often invisible. The silent corruption that wore a police badge, the chemical warfare of fentanyl, the deep-seated political influence that struck without a blade. Similarly, the greatest source of your renewal is unseen. The regenerative power of sleep, the quiet work of your hormones and your neurological pathways, mending the stress damage incurred during the day. Trust this unseen force. It is working for you, rebuilding the clean slate within your mind so that you can approach the next day with fresh eyes. The operative learned that guns and money, the tools of the cartel, were merely currency to control the exposed. The only true immunity was the integrity of purpose and the unattached heart. Tonight, let go of the desire for control that might be keeping you awake. You cannot manage the world from this position. Your integrity is proven by the simple fact that you chose to be here, seeking the nourishment of tranquility. Give yourself permission to be fully unattached to the outcomes you cannot influence. Imagine the heavy, black water of the Rio Grande. the border that both divides and connects the two nations in the story. As you breathe, feel the slow, inevitable current of that river. It carries the sediment of the past, the sorrow and the fear, but it also carries the quiet hope of new beginnings. You are floating on that current now, supported and secure. The water is cool and calm, and it will carry you effortlessly to the shores of deep sleep. Let every muscle in your body surrender its tension to the gravity that is pulling you toward rest. Release the small, tight muscles around your jaw and eyes. Allow your shoulders to sink deeply into the surface beneath you. Feel the wave of stillness move down your spine, releasing all the tension held in the large muscles of your back and legs. You are entirely heavy. You are entirely safe. You are entirely ready. The rhythmic beat of your heart is a private drum, marking the slow passage into the deep, dark calm. Each beat is a confirmation that your system is moving toward its natural, perfect order. Trust the silence. Trust the darkness. Trust the inherent strength that allowed the operative to survive the impossible. That same strength resides in you now, guiding you toward the deepest form of rest. The work is done. Peace is earned. Surrender to the quiet certainty of the night. The final surrender to stillness. As your mind embraces the final, perfect rhythm of this descent, allow your consciousness to narrow, focusing only on the gentle rise and fall of your chest. This simple, repetitive motion is the most ancient lullaby, the most reliable anchor in the world. Imagine the vast, empty sky above Mount Olympus, the place of the gods in the other great narrative. The gods are silent tonight. They are not interfering. There are no sudden lightning strikes, no unexpected oracles, and no battles to win. There's only the vast, indifferent peace of the cosmos. You are shielded beneath that same vast sky. Feel the final knots of tension unraveling, the slight clenching in your fists, the tiny furrow between your eyebrows. Let them soften, dissolving into the surface beneath you. Your thoughts, which may still drift like clouds across the high peaks of your mind, are losing their urgency. Watch them pass, offering no judgment, no resistance. They are simply narratives that are no longer required for survival. Sink lower. The weight is profound now, heavy and secure. You are perfectly placed, perfectly safe, and perfectly still. The journey is complete. The purpose has been achieved. There's nothing left to do but accept the restorative silence that now claims the night. Let the final measure of peace settle upon you. Imagine the quiet strength of the desert at dawn, untouched by the day's heat or the night's fear. That enduring, massive stillness is now your operating principle. You are the immovable object, the solid ground beneath the shifting narrative. Recognize the immense courage required simply to stop, to refuse the demand for continuous performance, continuous worry, continuous anxiety. In this quiet refusal, you find your deepest power. This act of cessation is not weakness. It is the ultimate affirmation of your need for restoration. The world can wait. The problems can wait. They do not belong here, in this sacred, temporary space of stillness. Sink further. The feeling of the surface beneath you is now the only reality. A deep, calm, profound support. Your hearing is receding, your vision is dimming, and your awareness is merging into the comfortable certainty of rest. All the complex systems of your body are slowing down, moving to a single, perfect rhythm that is carrying you gently, inevitably, toward the deep center of sleep. There is nothing to remember, nothing to solve, and nothing to hold on to. Let the last thoughts slip away like grains of sand through your open fingers. Surrender entirely to the process. You are being held by the structure of the narrative, the rhythm of the voice, and the simple, undeniable truth of your own exhaustion. Be here now, and then simply cease to be here. Drift. Before you surrender fully to the coming rest, I ask only for a moment of your consideration for this quiet work. The stories we share here, of profound struggle and systemic chaos, are intended to act as a safe harbor for your mind. They offer a steady focus, a detailed narrative to occupy the parts of your brain that might otherwise cling to the worries of the day or the anxieties of the future. By holding on to the rhythm of this voice and the complexity of this narrative, you are choosing to set down your own burdens for the duration of the night. This is the ultimate purpose of this channel, to provide structure for your serenity. If this journey into the profound truths of the border has brought you a measure of engagement and calm, please consider making two simple final gestures. First, subscribe to this channel. By choosing to subscribe, you help to ensure that the quiet, deliberate pace of these narratives can continue to be produced, allowing us to delve into the deep, untold stories of history, psychology, and complex human experience. Your choice supports the creation of more calming, thought-provoking content that honors the complexity of the world while guiding you toward rest. Second, if this story has resonated with you, please consider sharing it. A simple share with friends, family, or those who appreciate a narrative crafted with care and a deliberate pace helps others find this quiet sanctuary in the vast, noisy landscape of the internet. By sharing, you help us bring this peaceful, reflective storytelling to a wider audience. Thank you for allowing this narrative to unfold within your quiet space. Remember that the chaos of the story belongs only to the past. The calm of the present moment is yours to possess. May your mind be clear, your rest be deep, and your spirit be renewed by the profound stillness of the coming hours. Good night.